Yo, what is up YouTube? Today, what I want to talk about is knives. Specifically, what kind of knife you might want to think about getting for heading out bush or for doing wilderness skills. So this is really a guide to knives that is pretty much for a beginner. I'm not going to go into the different hardnesses of the steel or the metal or carbon or anything like that. This is purely for the beginner. Somebody who hasn't owned a knife before, who doesn't really know what they're doing around knives and wants to get a knife that will be a good survival type knife. So really what I'm going to be talking about is an all-rounder knife, which means that I'm obviously going to compromise on some of the things that would be really good in specific situations. So if you do have specific needs for a knife, then I recommend you probably go out and get that knife. Above all things, I recommend that you go out and you try using a knife out in the wilderness. That is by far the best way that you're going to figure out what actually works for you and what does not work for you. So I'm going to give you 6 things that I usually look for in a knife. The first one is use. What am I going to use this knife for? As I said, what I'm looking at today is more of a general purpose knife, but what are the specific tasks that I do when I'm using a knife? So for me, I'm usually outdoors, I'm doing wilderness type tasks. I might be working wood down, either whittling or even cutting down some sort of small tree. Skinning animals is probably another big thing that I do with a knife. And then general day-to-day work with the knife as well. So full disclaimer too, I don't usually just carry one knife. I usually have a fixed blade and a folder. And if I'm walking around town or something like that, then it's usually just a folder. If you are thinking about carrying a knife, then obviously look into the legalities of carrying a knife. You can't just carry a knife everywhere. It is possibly deemed a weapon, so you need to think about that as well and what circumstance you're using it in. So this would be more if you're going camping, thinking about what sort of tool you need in that campsite. Do your research, look at the legalities of carrying a knife in your area. So, size. Size matters, but probably not in the way that you're thinking. I have used machetes in the past, and machetes do have a very good specific use, especially for when you're clearing large areas of vegetation or even taking down small trees. However, if you're whittling down some wood, a machete might not be the best choice. It's not just necessarily bigger is better, it's the size that suits your task. For me, something around this size, I would deem a good bush knife. In reality, the size of the knife that I most likely use is something about yay big. So as you can see, this is actually quite a small blade. So this gets me through most tasks that I do. The second most used knife that I have is a little folder from CRKT or Cricket. They make great little knives. Again, it's a cheap little folder, not a very large blade, but very, very useful. And I use that on all sorts of things throughout the day. So yeah, think about what task you actually need to do. Do you need a huge bush knife? Do you need that Rambo style Bowie knife? Or can you get away with something smaller? If I am going out and setting up a campsite and I'm going to be doing a lot of wilderness activities or bushcraft type activities, then I'm probably going to be taking something bigger, like about the size of the SRK. Next thing you want to think about is the actual type. So do you need a folder? Do you need something that sits in your pocket? Or can you attach it to a belt and carry a fixed blade knife? Generally speaking, when I say to people, if you're going out into the wilderness, you're going to be doing wilderness activities, fixed blade knife is the way to go. And when I'm talking about fixed blade knives too, we're talking about full tang. So that is a blade that actually extends through the handle itself. So if the handle was to break, you're not left with a blade with a tiny little bit of metal. You can actually create another handle or even just use the metal tang, not a powdered fruit drink. If you're going out into the wilderness, my recommendation is that you look for a fixed blade knife. Grip. So ornamental type knives usually have really nice grips that look really good. I've seen a whole heap of them out there, resin type handles, bone handles, all this sort of stuff. My recommendation is whatever works for you. If you're a seasoned knife user, you know how to handle a knife, then definitely go for that polished wood look. I do myself. I like polished handled knives. You can see there, that is a wood handle. It's a nice redwood, polished up with ridges in it, so it makes it a little bit more grippy. As opposed to something like this, the rubberized handle of the SRK means that you're not going to lose grip of this even when it's wet. So it's a fantastic knife when it's wet. It's usually what I recommend to people when you're starting out looking at knives is to get something that has that rubberized handle. Don't necessarily go out and get the the fanciest looking knife, just something that's got a nice grip on it, because as any experienced woodsman or knife user will tell you, you will cut yourself with a knife eventually. But the more things you can do to help prevent that, the better off you'll be. Next thing you want to think about is the blade itself. So what kind of blade, or what does the blade look like that you're going to be using? Generally speaking, you know, straight blades, I say, are usually the best type of blade. So just a straight line along here. This is a normal point blade, being that it just comes to a point right at the end of it. We've got other types like drop points. So you can see on this one that the point actually drops down. Spear points are another one. All different types of points and blades that you can get. And there's a nice example of a curved blade. So not a lot of straight lines on this particular blade. And also things like serrated edges. So we've got like a little serrated edge on the Gerber LMF here that we can use for sawing or cutting activities. So it just depends on what you're actually needing to use your knife for. But for most people starting out, I just recommend a normal point with a straight edge, a good straight edge, fixed blade knife. Last thing I want to talk about is actually the cost of the knife. So this doesn't factor in for a lot of people, in that most people think that whatever they can afford is good enough. Very, very cheap knives though, in my experience, usually fail when you need them the most. But that's not to say that you should go out and buy an expensive knife. The most expensive knives that I've ever bought, and I have bought literally hundreds of knives in my life. The most expensive ones that I've ever bought, I've almost never used. They usually become ornamental pieces sitting up in a display somewhere and don't really get touched because I'm so afraid to break that, or I've invested so much in that knife that I don't want to wear it down or have it break on me. So one of my most used knives is actually the SRK from Cold Steel. I've used this one because I actually got it free. I was over in Afghanistan, I bought a whole heap of knives off Cold Steel and they packed this one in there as a bit of a thank you for the troops. So some American out there paid extra on their knife so that people over in Afghanistan could get free gear. So thank you, random American, whoever paid for this SRK. It got put to very good use over the years. Again, with my folder, the Cricut, this was a cheaper knife. I think this might have been about $80, which for a folder couldn't be expensive, but there's definitely cheaper options out there that you can get. But for me, I don't consider that too expensive and I've used it quite a lot. So I usually recommend in between that $40 to probably about $140 range. It depends on what your budget is, but that's kind of the sweet spot for me, where the knife will be good enough quality, but is not going to be so expensive that I don't want to use it at all. So in summary, there are literally thousands of knives out there that you can use. There's a whole heap of companies that I recommend, that I've used before, that I trust, that are very good quality. But for most people starting out, I just give them the one simple recommendation. That's usually Mora knives, M-O-R-A knives. So Mora knives out of Sweden make a very good quality knife that is very multifunctional and does not break the bank. It's relatively cheap. In fact, it's incredibly cheap for what you're actually getting out of a Mora knife. And I do own some Mora knives, and I've also lost some Mora knives and given them away, but I highly recommend them. You can scale Mora knives up. They've got different types in there, but their basic model is great for anyone who's just starting out in the knife game and need to get themselves something that's going to work in the most circumstances. Then definitely just go out and grab one of them. Okay, so that's the down and dirty layman's version of what kind of knife, the recommendations that I would give for what type of knife a beginner should grab. Keep those things in mind, and as I said, the most important thing really when it comes to knives is that you go out and you use them. So don't just buy a knife and stick it in a backpack and that's the last of it. Actually use your knife, take it out into the bush, try and do some bushcraft with it, bang it around, see how it stacks up, and see how it fits you. That's the only way you're going to learn what you do and do not like in a knife. Keep preparing, guys. Get out there, get out into the wilderness, use your stuff, use your gear, and especially when it comes to knives, it's probably one of those tools that is extremely hard to replace in an emergency situation. So make sure that you are investing in a knife and investing in the skills to utilize it. Until next time, guys, stay prepared, semper paratus. Gads out.